Here you go, Madison. It's better if you eat down here, less mess. The words, spoken in my daughter-in-law Sarah's bright, chirpy tone, hung in the air of the cavernous, minimalist dining room. They didn't seem to register at first. They were just sounds disconnected from meaning, like a line from a television show playing in another room. My son, Ethan, my only child, sat across the gleaming quartz table, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. Sarah scraped the leftover gristle from the prime rib, the fatty edges that had been trimmed from her and Ethan's perfect, ruby-red slices, onto a chipped ceramic plate. It was one of my old plates, I realized with a sickening lurch. One of the few things I had brought from my home. A floral-patterned relic from a life that felt a million miles away. Now it was being used like a dog's dish. She placed it on the floor, the polished concrete so cold it seemed to steal the warmth from the air around it. The plate made a dull, final-sounding clink. That sound broke the spell. It was the sound of my life shattering. This was my 70th birthday dinner. A milestone. A celebration. My gaze flickered from the plate on the floor, to Sarah's perfectly made-up face, to Ethan's oblivious profile. He was scrolling, his thumb moving in a steady rhythmic motion. A small laugh escaped his lips at something on the screen. The sound was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My name is Madison, and on my 70th birthday this was my gift. I looked at Sarah. There was no malice in her eyes. That would have been easier to bear. Malice is a hot emotion, something you can fight. This was something colder, more terrifying. It was utter indifference. To her, I wasn't a person. I was a problem, a piece of old furniture, an inconvenience that needed to be managed. The less mess was the justification. A thin veneer of practicality over a chasm of contempt. My knees protested as I slowly lowered myself to the floor. 70 years old. I had taught history for 40 of them. I had raised a son, buried a husband, managed a home. I had paid taxes, voted in every election, and baked casseroles for sick neighbors. And it had all led to this. Kneeling on a cold floor in Oak Creek, Colorado, to eat the scraps from my own birthday dinner. The prime rib was cold and greasy. I picked up a piece with my trembling fingers, not wanting to make the sound of a fork scraping against the plate. The silence in the room was a living thing. It was immense, heavier than any sound could ever be. It was the silence of Ethan not speaking up. The silence of a son watching his mother be humiliated. That silence was my answer. It told me everything I needed to know. The boy I had raised, the man I had loved, was gone. In his place was this hollowed-out stranger, who couldn't even lift his eyes from a glowing screen to defend his own mother. I ate. I chewed each tough, fatty piece slowly, methodically. I did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a glacier of grief and rage that had been building for months. This was just the final layer of ice. This was the moment the woman they knew, the quiet, grieving widow they could push around and patronize, began to die. And in the cold, silent tomb of her heart, someone else, something else was starting to wake up. I finished the scraps. I didn't leave a single morsel. I sat there for a moment, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap, the empty, chipped plate in front of me like an offering at a profane altar. Sarah finally looked over at me, a flicker of something, annoyance, impatience, in her eyes. "All done?" she asked, her voice the same one she used on their pampered golden retriever, Max. I simply nodded. She took the plate without a word and placed it directly into the dishwasher, her movements efficient and dismissive. The transaction was complete. The dog had been fed. Ethan finally put his phone down. "That was a great dinner, honey," he said to Sarah, completely oblivious. He stretched, then looked at me, still on the floor. A brief, uncomfortable expression crossed his face. "You okay down there, Mom?" I looked into my son's eyes, searching for a flicker of the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees, the teenager who I taught to drive, the young man who cried on my shoulder when his first girlfriend broke his heart. I found nothing. Just a placid emptiness. A desire for the discomfort of the moment to simply go away. "I'm fine, Ethan," I said. My voice was steady, It didn't sound like my own. It sounded stronger, colder. Just resting my legs. He accepted this. Of course he did. It was the easy answer. It required nothing of him. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the meal. It was a hollow, empty silence that filled the spaces between them as they cleaned up, their movements synchronized in a way that excluded me entirely. I was an island, a ghost in my own life story. I could hear the faint, insistent clicks of Sarah's phone. She was leaning against the counter, her head tilted, a small, self-satisfied smile on her face as she typed. I knew what she was doing. She was curating the evening for her online audience, crafting the narrative. A few minutes later, my own phone, an old model that Ethan and Sarah constantly made fun of, buzzed on the small end table in the corner where I was allowed to charge it. It was a notification. Sarah had tagged a photo. My fingers felt stiff as I picked it up and opened the app. There it was. A perfect, artfully arranged shot of her plate. The prime rib was fanned out beautifully, a sprig of rosemary placed just so. Beside it, a crystal glass of red wine caught the light. The caption read, "Nothing better than a quiet birthday dinner for the mother-in-law. Family is everything. Bless family first, making memories." The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. It wasn't just that she was lying. She was erasing my reality and replacing it with her own shiny, filtered version. To her thousands of followers, she was the perfect, doting daughter-in-law, caring for her elderly mother-in-law. They would see the photo and like it. They would leave comments praising her. And in the same room, the subject of her feigned affection was sitting on the floor, the greasy taste of leftovers still in her mouth. I looked back at my son. He was watching TV now, his arm draped around Sarah's shoulders. He glanced at me, caught my eye, and gave a weak, apologetic shrug, his mouth twisting into a semblance of a sympathetic grimace. That shrug, that pathetic, cowardly gesture, it was worse than a slap. It was a confession. It said, "I know this is wrong, but her happiness is more important than your dignity. My comfort is more important than your pain. I will not help you." The fire that had started in my gut during the meal began to change. The wild, chaotic burn of humiliation cooled, compressed, and hardened into something else. It became a solid core of purpose, a cold, dense star of rage. The humiliation was a physical thing. A sickness that I knew would destroy me if I let it. But the rage was fuel. I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Tears were a currency they didn't deserve. Instead, I thought of David, my husband of 45 years. I pictured his face, the kind lines around his eyes, the way he would stand up for what was right, no matter how small the injustice. He would never have allowed this. He would have seen Sarah for what she was from a mile away. He would have taken one look at the man his son had become and his heart would have broken. And in the silent house, with the sound of a canned laugh track from the television filling the void, I made a promise. It was a silent vow, spoken only in the deepest chambers of my heart. A promise to myself that I was done being the victim in their story. And a promise to the memory of my husband, David. I promised him that our name, the life we built, the respect we earned would not end like this. It would not end with me on my knees, eating scraps from a chipped plate. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. They thought they were burying a week-old woman. They had no idea they were planting a seed. My name is Madison Hayes. I am 70 years old. Before I was the ghost in the guest room, before I was the woman who ate from a dog's dish on the cold kitchen floor, I was a wife, a mother, and a teacher. For 40 years I stood in front of classrooms filled with restless teenagers and tried to breathe life into the dusty pages of history. I taught them about empires that rose and fell, about revolutions born from quiet whispers of discontent, and about the intricate, often invisible threads that connect a single moment of injustice to a sweeping tide of change. I never imagined my own life would become such a lesson. My life with David was my great empire. It wasn't built on land or gold, but on shared laughter, inside jokes whispered over morning coffee, and the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's souls. He was an architect, a man who built things to last, and the sturdiest thing he ever built was our life together. He had this way of looking at me, even after 45 years of marriage, that made me feel like the most fascinating person in the world. We had a plan, you see. A meticulously crafted blueprint for our golden years. Our world map on the study wall was peppered with colored pins, each one a promise. A cruise through the Greek Isles, a train journey along the Silk Road, a quiet cottage rental in the Irish countryside. We were supposed to grow old seeing the world, not shrink into the four walls of a spare bedroom. But a year ago, a heart attack, sudden and merciless, tore through our blueprint. It didn't just take David, it took our future. It took the color from the world and left me in a monochrome fog of grief. The house, our beautiful home that David had designed, the one with the rose garden he tended so carefully and the marks on the kitchen doorframe where we measured our son Ethan's height year after year, suddenly felt cavernous. Every room echoed with his absence. The scent of his pipe tobacco lingered in the study. His favorite worn armchair sat empty by the fireplace. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a mausoleum of memories, and I was its lonely curator. It was during this time, when I was most adrift, that Ethan and his wife Sarah presented their solution. "Sell the house, Mom," Ethan had said, his voice soft with a concern I now know was counterfeit. "It's too much for you to manage alone. Come live with us. We'll take care of you." It's what Dad would have wanted. And I believed him. I was a history teacher. I understood strategy and motivation. But grief is a powerful blinder. It smudges the sharp edges of reason and leaves you reaching for any semblance of a lifeline. I saw my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose triumphs I had celebrated, and I saw a sanctuary. I didn't see the calculating ambition in his wife's eyes or the weak-willed convenience in his. I saw family. So I sold the house. I packed up 45 years of a shared life into cardboard boxes, parting with furniture and memories that felt like extensions of my own limbs. The proceeds, a considerable sum that was meant to fund our travels, I transferred into a new joint account with Ethan. "For convenience," he'd said. "So I can help you manage things, pay the bills without you having to worry." I signed the papers in a daze, my signature a testament not to foolishness, but to a broken heart's desperate bid for connection. I wasn't a stupid woman. I was a grieving one. And I trusted my only son. I believed, with the foolish conviction of a mother, that family was a harbor in the storm. I had no idea I was willingly sailing into the eye of the hurricane. The sanctuary I had imagined turned out to be a cage, albeit one with tasteful, neutral-toned walls and expensive, uncomfortable furniture. The transition was subtle at first, a series of small, almost imperceptible erosions of my identity. My life became a litany of small humiliations, each one a quiet chisel chipping away at the woman I used to be. I was no longer Madison Hayes, respected educator and beloved wife. I was an occupant, a utility. My days, once filled with lesson plans, gardening, and long walks with David, were now structured around the needs of Ethan and Sarah's household. I became their unpaid help. I was the built-in babysitter for their two young children. My own plans for the day dissolving the moment Sarah announced she had a last-minute yoga class or a networking lunch that couldn't be missed. There was no asking, only informing. "Madison dear, I'll need you to watch the kids this afternoon. I'm swamped." The dear was a weapon. A sugary coating on a bitter pill of command. I was the mate too. I'd find myself tidying the living room long after they'd gone to bed, folding laundry that wasn't mine, wiping down kitchen counters still sticky from their hurried breakfast. These tasks were never requested, but their absence was noted with pointed sighs and passive-aggressive comments. "It's just so hard to keep on top of everything," Sarah would lament to a friend on the phone, loud enough for me to hear from the next room. My presence in my own son's home became conditional. My opinions on politics, books, or even the weather were met with polite, vacant smiles or worse, Sarah's patronizing explanations, as if I were a child who couldn't possibly grasp modern complexities. "Oh, Madison," she'd say with a little laugh, "it's a bit more complicated than that." She spoke to me as if my mind had packed its bags and left when David did. Control was her currency, and she spent it lavishly on me. The living room television, once a source of shared pleasure in my old home, became her domain. If I was watching a classic film, she would enter the room, sigh dramatically about her stressful day, and switched the channel to a shrill reality show without a word of consultation. It was a small act, but it was a declaration. Your comfort is irrelevant. Even food became a tool of control. My portions were policed under the guise of health. Just a small piece of chicken for you, dear. We have to think about your heart. This from a woman who would then post photos of her extravagant multi-course dinners at fancy restaurants on social media, funded by the very account I had so trustingly contributed to. And Ethan, my son, he was the silent partner in my erasure. He was a passive observer, a ghost in his own house, weakened by his wife's relentless ambition and his own spineless desire for a life free of conflict. I would see him watch Sarah's casual cruelties. I would catch his eye, sending a silent, desperate plea for him to intervene, to say something, anything, to remind her that I was his mother. And he would look away. He would clear his throat and change the subject. He would pick up his phone and scroll, retreating into a digital world where he didn't have to witness his mother slowly disappearing. His silence was a betrayal far deeper than any of Sarah's overt insults. Her cruelty was that of a stranger, but his was the intimate treachery of a son. He was the one who held the door open while Sarah dismantled my life piece by piece. He allowed her to speak to me that way. He allowed me to become the invisible woman who lived in their guest room. There was one evening a few months before my birthday that I remember with chilling clarity. I had been telling a story about a trip David and I took to the Grand Canyon, recalling how Ethan, as a little boy, had been so convinced he could shout and make the echo answer him by name. I was laughing at the memory, and for a fleeting moment I felt like myself again. I looked at Ethan, expecting to see a flicker of shared nostalgia in his eyes. Instead, I saw him glance at Sarah, a quick, nervous tick. She was rolling her eyes, her mouth set in a tight line of pure boredom. Ethan's smile vanished. He mumbled something about an early morning and left the room. In that moment I understood. I was a relic, a ghost telling stories only she cared about. My history, our family's history, was an inconvenience to the sleek modern life they were building. I was the old furniture that didn't match the new decor. And as I sat there in the silent living room, the echo of my own laughter mocking me, I realized I was utterly and completely alone. The process of being erased was nearly complete. All that was left was the final public humiliation to codify my new status, an event that was, unbeknownst to any of us, just around the corner. The change was so gradual I almost didn't notice it, like the slow turning of a season you only recognize when you suddenly need a coat. It began with my clothes. One afternoon, Sarah came home with 2 large, crinkly plastic bags. Her smile was the kind she used for photographs, wide and showing all her teeth but not reaching her eyes. "I went thrift shopping for you, Madison," she announced, her voice echoing a little too loudly in the pristine, minimalist living room. "It's so much more sustainable, and honestly so much more interesting than all that department store stuff." She pulled out a mustard yellow cardigan, pilled and smelling faintly of mothballs and someone else's perfume. Then came a pair of shapeless polyester slacks. I looked down at my own perfectly good trousers, the ones David had bought me just before he passed. They were simple, classic, comfortable. "Oh, Sarah, that's thoughtful. But I have plenty of clothes." "Don't be silly," she said, waving a dismissive hand, her diamond ring catching the light. "These have character. Your old things are so dated." She began clearing a space in my small closet in the basement, pulling out my favorite cashmere sweater. "We'll donate these. Make room for the new." The new things were scratchy. They hung on my frame like sacks, a constant abrasive reminder that I was now a charity case. Meanwhile, every other day a delivery truck would arrive. Boxes from Net-a-Porter, from Saks, from boutique brands I'd never heard of. I would watch from the kitchen window as Sarah brought them in, her face alight with genuine excitement. Later, I'd hear her through the floorboards, filming one of her videos for the internet. Her voice, a syrupy, enthusiastic whisper, would narrate the unboxing. "Oh my God, you guys, look at this gorgeous silk blouse from Chloe. The fabric is just to die for." I would be downstairs folding her expensive, new clothes, the feel of cheap polyester on my own skin. The joint account, the one I had poured my life savings into, the proceeds from the house David and I had built together, was a river. and her purchases were a gaping, insatiable mouth. Then came the stories. When her friends came over for book club, books they never discussed replaced by wine and gossip, I was instructed to stay in my basement room. But sometimes I had to come up for a glass of water or to use the main floor bathroom. I would try to be invisible, to slip past the living room where they sat on the cream-colored sofa, but Sarah always seemed to spot me. "Oh, there she is," she'd say, her voice dropping into a tone of theatrical pity. Her friends' heads would turn. "Madison dear, are you lost? The bathroom is the other way." I wasn't lost, but I would just nod mutely, my face burning with shame, and turn around. One afternoon I overheard her talking to her friend Jessica. I was just on the other side of the kitchen island, polishing silverware, my movements slow and quiet. "It's her dementia," Sarah said, a sigh punctuating the sentence. "It's progressing so quickly. Some days she doesn't even know who Ethan is. It's a full-time job, honestly. But what can you do? She's family. We're saints for taking her in, I know, but it's just a lot." I froze, the silver fork cold in my hand. I looked over at Ethan, who was scrolling on his phone at the dining table, a fortress of indifference built around him. He heard her. Of course he heard her. His only reaction was a slight tightening of his jaw before his thumb resumed its relentless, flicking motion across the screen. He was a co-signer on her lie. My son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose fevers I had cooled with damp cloths, was letting this woman paint me as a lunatic to her friends. The silverware felt impossibly heavy. I set it down, the clatter swallowed by the cavernous silence of the house. The lie served a dual purpose. It explained my thrift store clothes and my quiet, withdrawn nature. And it provided the perfect cover for the financial bleeding. One morning I needed to buy new insoles for my shoes. My arthritis had been particularly bad, and the old ones were worn thin. I took the debit card for the joint account, the one I had been told was for household expenses, to the pharmacy. At the checkout, the young cashier swiped it once, then twice. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice soft with embarrassment for me. "It's declined." Declined. The word hung in the air, thick with humiliation. I had over $300,000 in that account when I'd moved in. I paid with the last $20 bill in my wallet and walked home. Each step a painful throb in my feet and in my heart. That evening, I gathered the courage to ask Ethan. I found him in the garage polishing his new sports car. "Ethan," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "The card. It didn't work today. Is everything all right with the account?" He didn't look at me, just kept buffing a small circular pattern into the hood. "Everything's fine, Mom. Probably just a security flag on the bank's end. Don't worry about it." The next day, the family iPad was left on the kitchen counter. An email notification was on the screen, a confirmation from a luxury travel agency. My eyes scanned the words. "Your booking to Bali is confirmed. 2 first-class tickets. The Four Seasons Sion. The departure date was in 3 weeks. The cost was more than my husband and I had spent on our honeymoon, our anniversary trips, and every vacation we'd ever taken combined. The lie about the property taxes, the lie about the security flag. It all collapsed into a single, ugly truth. They were living a life of stolen luxury, and I was the ghost who paid for it. The eating on the floor incident, the one that finally broke the last thread of hope inside me, wasn't an isolated storm. It was the hurricane that had been building for months, one cruel gust at a time. It started with portion sizes. Sarah would plate their dinners first, thick cuts of steak, generous helpings of roasted vegetables. Then she would turn to me and spoon a small, almost childish portion onto a chipped plate she kept for me. "Don't want you to overdo it, Madison. It's not good for your heart at your age." Soon after, it became leftovers. While they ate freshly cooked salmon, I would be given a reheated bowl of yesterday's pasta. Then came the final demotion. "Madison, would you mind eating at the kitchen counter?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice as sweet as poison. "It's just that the crumbs get everywhere, and it's easier to clean one spot." So I ate at the counter, perched on a hard stool, my back to them while they sat at the grand dining table. I could hear the murmur of their conversation, the clinking of their wine glasses, the sound of a family I was no longer a part of. I was the help. They had a dog, a beautiful, boisterous golden retriever named Max. And Max was treated with more respect, more affection, more dignity than I ever was. His bed was a plush, orthopedic memory foam cushion that sat in the sunniest spot of the living room. My bed was a lumpy, creaking futon in the corner of the damp, musty basement, right next to the groaning water heater that would shudder to life at all hours of the night. Every morning, Sarah would measure out Max's special organic, grain-free food into a polished stainless steel bowl. She'd mix in a spoonful of expensive fish oil for his coat. "There you go, my handsome boy," she'd coo, scratching him behind the ears as he ate. Ethan would come over and give him a pat. "Attaboy, Max." My breakfast, if I got one, was a piece of dry toast left on the counter. My cup was a faded plastic one from a long-forgotten picnic, while they drank their coffee from artisanal ceramic mugs. Max had a filtered water fountain. I drank tap water that tasted of metal. The hierarchy of the house was brutally clear. First came Sarah, then Ethan, then Max the dog. And then somewhere far below came me. I was less than the family pet. I was just a presence, a problem, a resource to be drained. The nights were the worst. I'd lie on that miserable futon, the cold of the concrete floor seeping into my bones, and listen to the sounds of the house. The rhythmic rumble of the furnace, the distant chime of the television, the soft thud of footsteps on the floor above me. It was the sound of a life happening without me. I would stare into the darkness, my hand clutching the thin, worn blanket, and wonder how it had come to this. How the son I had raised could stand by and watch his mother be erased, bit by painful bit. The final illusion shattered on a Tuesday evening. The air was heavy with the coming rain. I had a headache and went upstairs, hoping to find some aspirin in the kitchen. As I padded down the hallway in my worn slippers, I passed Ethan's home office. The door was cracked open just enough for a sliver of light to cut across the dark floor. And I heard Sarah's voice. It wasn't her loud, performative voice for guests, or her cloying, condescending voice for me. It was a low, conspiratorial murmur, the kind people use when they believe no one is listening. I stopped, my hand hovering over my chest. I knew I shouldn't listen, but I was a starving woman, and this was the first morsel of unguarded truth I had encountered in months. "No, I understand the threshold is high," she was saying into her phone, her voice smooth as silk. "But we have plenty of evidence. Last week she tried to water the fake plants. The week before she put the milk in the pantry. It's getting worse, Mr. Davison. It's a kindness, really." My blood went cold. She was talking about me, and she was lying. I had never done any of those things. "We need to discuss power of attorney," she continued, and I could almost hear the smile in her voice. "We just need to protect her from herself. And from her finances. She gets confused easily. It's a danger. A lawyer." She was on the phone with a lawyer. The voice on the other end was a low professional drone, but I caught a few words. Declare her mentally incompetent. Full conservatorship. Control of all assets. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just casual cruelty born of selfishness. This was a plan. A cold, calculated, methodical plot to strip me of my autonomy, my money, and my identity. They weren't just letting me fade away. They were actively engineering my complete and total destruction. They wanted to turn me into a legal ghost, a non-person with a pulse, whose only purpose was to fund their lavish life until I had the decency to die. That night, lying on my lumpy futon in the cold, dark basement, I didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been wrung out of me long ago, replaced by a deep, hollow ache. The hum of the water heater sounded like a clock, ticking down the minutes of my life, a life they were trying to steal. But as I stared at the faint outline of the pipes on the ceiling, the ache began to change. It wasn't the soft, yielding pain of a victim anymore. It was hardening. It was solidifying into something cold and sharp and heavy. It was the weight of a promise, made in the dark, to the memory of my husband, and to the woman I used to be. The woman they thought they had already buried. They were wrong. The morning after my birthday dawned gray and silent. as if the world itself was holding its breath in shame. The usual clatter of Sarah getting ready for her day, the sharp clicks of her heels on the hardwood, was muted. Ethan had left for work without a word. A phantom slipping out before the sun had a chance to witness his cowardice. I remained in my small room, the ghost in the guest house, my bones aching with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The phantom pains in my knees from the hard floor were a dull rhythmic reminder of the previous night. I didn't cry. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside me, forming a solid, sharp core where my heart used to be. The doorbell chimed at precisely 10 o'clock. Its melodic two-note sound was an intrusion, a foreign element in the suffocating silence of the house. I heard Sarah's annoyed sigh from the living room, followed by the sound of her footsteps, sharper and more irritated than usual. I crept to my door, cracking it open just enough to see the entryway. A man stood on the porch. He was of medium height, with salt and pepper hair cut neatly, and he wore a simple, impeccably tailored gray suit. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and had an air of quiet, unshakable patience. Sarah opened the door, but not all the way. She used her body as a barrier, her posture radiating hostility. "Can I help you?" Her voice was clipped, the manufactured sweetness she used for strangers completely absent. "Good morning," the man said, his voice calm and even. "My name is Arthur Chun. I'm here to see Mrs. Madison Hayes." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "She's not seeing anyone today. She's resting." It was a lie and we both knew it. She made it sound as though I were an invalid, a fragile piece of porcelain to be kept under glass. Mr. Chun didn't so much as blink. "I'm afraid my business with her is both personal and time-sensitive. I am the legal counsel for her late husband's estate." A flicker of something, greed perhaps or suspicion, crossed Sarah's face. David's estate? That was all settled last year. Ethan handled everything. "Not everything, it would seem," Mr. Chun replied smoothly. "My instructions were very specific. I must speak with Mrs. Hayes. Alone." "That's not possible," Sarah snapped, her voice rising. "Anything you have to say to my mother-in-law you can say to me. We handle her affairs. She gets confused." She said the last word with a theatrical drop in her voice, a performance of concern for an audience of one. I felt a surge of cold fury. Confused. That was the word she would use. The convenient label for a person you wish to silence. Mr. Chen's gaze drifted past Sarah, and for a heart-stopping second, his eyes met mine through the crack in the door. He gave no sign of recognition, but his next words were aimed directly at me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying clearly into the hallway. "My name is Arthur Chun. Your husband, David, entrusted me with a matter of great importance. I have come today to fulfill my final obligation to him." The mention of David's name was a key turning a lock deep inside me. Before Sarah could protest, I pushed my door open and walked into the hallway. I was still in my worn dressing gown, my hair uncombed, but I stood as tall as I could. "I am Madison Hayes," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "I will speak with Mr. Chun." Sarah shot me a look of pure venom, her mask of civility crumbling. "Mother, go back to your room. This is inappropriate. You don't know what you're doing." "On the contrary, Sarah," I said, meeting her glare. "For the first time in a very long time, I think I do." Mr. Chun gave a slight, formal bow of his head. "If we could have a moment," he asked, his gaze fixed on Sarah, a polite but firm dismissal. Defeated for the moment, Sarah seethed. She stepped back from the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Fine. But the living room, where I can see you." "That will not be necessary," Mr. Chun said. "My instructions were for a private conversation." He looked at me. "Is there somewhere we can speak, Mrs. Hayes?" I gestured towards my small room. It was humiliating, the threadbare rug, the single window looking out onto a brick wall, the general air of being a storage closet for a person. But it was the only space that was mine. "In here." He followed me without a word. Sarah hovered in the doorway, her face a thundercloud. Mr. Chun turned, placing a hand on the doorknob. "I will be sure to let you know when we are finished," he said, and with a quiet click, he shut the door in her face. For a moment we stood in silence. The room felt even smaller with his presence. He wasn't a large man, but he carried an aura of significance that filled the space. He placed his briefcase on the small, rickety desk and opened it. From inside he removed a simple, thick manila envelope. It was sealed with a wax stamp bearing a D, David's initial. He held it out to me. His hands were steady, his expression compassionate but professional. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice softer now. David was more than a client. He was a friend. He was a very meticulous man. He planned for every eventuality. My hand trembled as I took the envelope. It felt heavy, impossibly so. "What is this?" "It is a final provision from his will," Mr. Chun explained. "David instructed me to give this to you exactly 1 year after his passing, or upon evidence of what he called a failure of character from his heir. I believe that condition has been met, Mrs. Hayes." His words hung in the air. A failure of character. The phrase was so precise, so David. It wasn't about anger or disappointment. It was about a fundamental lapse in integrity. My mind flashed to the plate on the floor, to Ethan's averted eyes, to the cold, calculated cruelty. Evidence. I had a lifetime of it. "I visited one of your family's social media pages this morning. After an anonymous tip," Mr. Chun added gently, as if sensing my thoughts. "A photograph from last night's celebration. It was more than enough to satisfy the legal threshold. The picture, the one Sarah had posted, family is everything." The hypocrisy was so vast it was almost comical. I clutched the envelope to my chest, the sharp corners digging into my palm. It was the first solid thing I had felt in a year. I waited until I heard the front door close, signaling Mr. Chen's departure. I waited until I heard Sarah stomp up the stairs and slam her bedroom door. The house sank back into its oppressive silence, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world on the verge of changing. I sat on the edge of my bed, the manila envelope lying on my lap. My fingers traced the outline of the wax seal, the familiar, elegant D that David used on all his important correspondence. It was like a piece of him, a final touch from a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. For a long time I just sat there, unable to bring myself to open it. Felt too final, like reading the last page of our story. But David was a planner. He wouldn't have done this without a profound reason. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I broke the seal. My fingers, clumsy with age and anxiety, fumbled with the clasp. Inside there were 2 things. A sheaf of thick, legal-looking documents, bound in blue, and a handwritten letter on his personal stationery. I set the legal papers aside and unfolded the letter. His handwriting, a strong, decisive script, was so familiar it brought a fresh wave of grief. "My dearest Maddie," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and a year has passed. Or, and this is the possibility that has kept me awake more nights than I can count, our son has failed you. I pray it is the former, that you are simply reading a final love letter from an old man who adored you more than life itself. But I was never a man to rely on prayer alone. I need to tell you a story, our story, but the parts one kept hidden. I did it not from a lack of trust in you, my love, but from a desire to protect you. To protect the simple, beautiful life we built. You always said I treated our finances like a state secret. You were right. You thought my obsession with planning was a quirk. It was a necessity. Remember our little diner? The Sunrise Grill? Remember how proud we were? You with your history books behind the counter, me flipping burgers and dreaming. You thought we sold it for a modest profit to fund our retirement. That's only half the truth, Maddie. I didn't just sell it. I leveraged it. That little diner was the seed. The first tiny investment in what would become a silent partnership. Was the majority shareholder and silent founder of the Gilded Fork restaurant franchise. I stopped reading. The words didn't make sense. The Gilded Fork? The upscale, trendy chain of restaurants that were popping up in every major city? The one Sarah and Ethan were always so desperate to get a reservation at? The company Sarah was so proud to work for as a mid-level manager? It was impossible. We had lived a quiet middle-class life. We drove sensible cars, took modest vacations. David was a diner owner, a man who smelled of onions and coffee, not a corporate tycoon. I forced myself to read on, my heart hammering against my ribs. I kept my name off everything, using holding companies and trusted proxies like Arthur Chan. I didn't want that world to touch us. I didn't want the money to change what we had, which was real. It was an engine running silently in the background of our lives, a safety net you never knew you had. Upon my death, my will stipulated that controlling interest in the entire corporation would pass to our son, Ethan. It was his birthright, the legacy I built for him. But a legacy is more than money, Maddie. It is character. It is honor. And so I included a provision, a failsafe. Arthur called it a morality clause. A dead man's switch, I called it. The clause is very specific. It states that Ethan's inheritance is conditional upon him providing you, his mother, with the respect, care, and dignity you deserve. If he or his chosen spouse should engage in any act of cruelty, neglect, or financial exploitation against you, the clause is triggered. If that clause is triggered, Maddie, his inheritance is void. Instantly. Irrevocably. And 100% of the shares in the Gilded Fork Holdings, the entire chain, its real estate, its assets, its cash reserves, everything transfers immediately to you. It is all yours. Not in trust. Not with conditions. It becomes yours, absolutely and completely. I saw a shadow in Ethan, a weakness I hoped he would outgrow. A desire to please others, especially Sarah, at the expense of his own convictions. I hoped your love would be his anchor, but I feared her ambition would be his storm. This was my way of protecting you from that storm. This is my final gift to you, my love. Not the money, but the power. The power to be free. Use it. Live beautifully. Don't let them diminish you. You were always a queen, Maddie. It's time you had your kingdom. Forever yours, David. I let the letter fall into my lap. The room was spinning. A queen. A kingdom. The Gilded Fork. It was all too much. My entire life, the narrative I had built around myself, a retired teacher, a simple widow living on her husband's modest pension, was a fiction. Not a lie, but a carefully curated story with the most important chapter ripped out. I picked up the legal documents. They were dense, filled with jargon I didn't understand, but the titles were clear. Transfer of controlling interest. Activation of Testamentary Clause 7B. Deed of ownership for Gilded Fork Holdings LLC. My name was there. Madison Hayes. Typed in neat black ink. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. Sarah, with her petty cruelties and her desperate social climbing, had been working for my company. She had thrown my food on the floor in a house that, for all intents and purposes, I could buy and demolish 100 times over. Ethan, my son, had stood by and watched his mother be humiliated, all for a life of luxury that was never truly his to begin with. He had traded his mother's dignity for an inheritance he had already forfeited. The cold, hard knot of frozen tears inside me began to melt. But it wasn't grief I felt. It was fire. A rage so pure and so potent it seemed to burn away the fog of sorrow and helplessness that had shrouded me for the last year. David hadn't just left me a fortune. He had left me a weapon, and I finally intended to use it. The first step was a phone call. My hand was perfectly steady as I dialed the number for Mr. Chen's office. When his secretary answered, my voice was clear and firm. Please tell Mr. Chen that Madison Hayes is ready to claim her kingdom. The counterattack came sooner than I expected. It was not a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation in the living room. It was colder, more insidious. It arrived via courier 2 days later. A thick, intimidating letter from a downtown law firm, addressed to me, care of Mr. Chen. He had come to the house to discuss our strategy, meeting me at a small coffee shop a few blocks away to avoid the viper's nest. He'd laid out the initial steps, filing the transfer paperwork with the board of Gilded Fork Holdings, officially notifying Ethan of the invocation of Clause 7B. He had warned me it would be a fight. I just hadn't understood the nature of that fight. He read the letter from their lawyer, his face impassive, but a muscle tightening in his jaw. They're not just fighting it, he said. looking up at me over the rim of his glasses. "They're claiming you've already relinquished your rights." He slid a document across the table. It was a high-quality photocopy. The header read, "Waiver of future inheritance claims." It was a legal agreement dated 6 months prior, stating that in exchange for Ethan and Sarah providing me with lifelong housing and care, I, Madison Hayes, voluntarily and with full mental competence, waived any and all future claims on the estate of David Hayes. And there, at the bottom, was my signature. It was perfect. The familiar, slightly shaky loop of them, the way my S always leaned a little to the right. It was my handwriting, my signature, my name. And it was a complete and utter lie. I had never seen this document before in my life. "It's a forgery," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The violation was so profound it made me feel physically ill. They hadn't just abused me. They had stolen my very identity, my name, and twisted it into a tool for their greed. "A very, very good one," Mr. Chun said grimly. "Their lawyer is claiming this document predates and supersedes the morality clause. They're going to argue that you willingly signed your rights away long before any recent events. They are building a narrative, Mrs. Hayes. They will try to prove you are senile, that your memory is failing, that you signed this willingly and simply forgot. Or they will suggest that I am a manipulative lawyer taking advantage of a confused elderly woman, and that David's secret will is the actual fraud." The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just a moral issue. It was a vicious legal war. My word against theirs. A grieving widow against a concerned, caring son and his wife. I could already hear Sarah's testimony in my head, dripping with false sympathy. "She gets so confused, Your Honor. She signs things and doesn't remember. We've been so worried about her." They were going to use my age, my grief, my quiet nature against me, painting me as an unreliable narrator of my own life. The world suddenly felt like quicksand. David's final gift, my path to freedom, was being swallowed by a lie written in my own hand. The legal system was a foreign country with a language I didn't speak. Mr. Chun was my only guide, but he was facing a perfectly executed forgery and a client who, to the outside world, looked exactly like the person they were describing. An old woman who had just lost her husband and moved in with her son. It was a plausible story. A more plausible story than a secret restaurant empire and a dead man's switch. Doubt began to creep in, cold and oily. What if no one believed me? What if I lost? The thought of returning to that house, not as a guest but as a legally certified burden, was more terrifying than death itself. The heaviest blow, however, did not come from a lawyer. Came from my son. He came to me that evening. I was in my room, staring at the photocopy of the forged document, trying to find a flaw, a single pen stroke that didn't belong to me. There was a soft knock on the door. It wasn't Sarah's sharp rap. It was hesitant. "Mom." I didn't answer. He opened the door anyway and stood there, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of sorrow. He looked like the little boy who used to come to my room after a nightmare, seeking comfort. It was a calculated, cruel performance. He sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. He didn't look at me at first, just stared at his hands which he wrung together. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with manufactured pain. I remained silent, clutching the forged paper. "This lawyer. This Mr. Chun. He's filling your head with nonsense. A restaurant empire? Mom, Dad owned a diner. He sold it 20 years ago. You're not well. You've been through so much. This man is taking advantage of you." The gaslighting was so blatant, so audacious, it nearly took my breath away. He was trying to convince me that I was crazy, that the letter in David's own handwriting was a figment of my imagination. "And now you're suing us?" he went on, his voice breaking. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with tears. They were real tears, I think. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity. "After everything we've done for you? We took you in when you had nowhere else to go. We've been supporting you. And this is how you repay us? By trying to ruin us." Every word was a twisting knife. "We took you in. As if I were a stray dog, not a mother who had poured her life savings into their joint account. We've been supporting you with my own money, which they bled dry for their designer clothes and luxury vacations. Sarah's a mess, Mom, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She's just stressed. She's got so much pressure on her at work. She doesn't always mean the things she says. You know how she is. But she's my wife. She's the mother of my children. He conveniently left out that they had no children. She's my family. And you're destroying it. You're destroying my family. There it was. The final betrayal. He wasn't just a passive bystander to Sarah's cruelty. He was an active architect of this narrative, the one where I was the villain. I was the vengeful old woman, ungrateful and destructive, tearing apart her son's happiness out of spite. He didn't apologize for the humiliation, for the neglect, for the theft. He blamed me for discovering it. The emotional weight of his words was staggering, a physical pressure on my chest. This was my son, my only child, the baby I had held, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the young man whose accomplishments had been my greatest pride. David had worried about his weakness, but I had never seen this. This hollowing out of his soul, this complete abdication of love and loyalty in favor of a comfortable life. Choosing my freedom, I realized with a sudden devastating clarity, meant severing my only family tie. To fight for the kingdom David had left me, I had to accept that the prince was already gone. The man sitting on my bed was a stranger wearing my son's face. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the false tears to the panic in his eyes. He wasn't sad for me. He was terrified for himself. He was afraid of losing the lifestyle Sarah had taught him to crave. Slowly, deliberately, I folded the photocopy of the forgery and placed it on the nightstand. I looked at his tear-streaked face. The love I felt for him was still there. A phantom limb that ached with a pain beyond description. But it was love for a memory. For a boy who no longer existed. "Get out of my room, Ethan," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was as cold and as hard as the core of ice in my chest. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Mom, please. Just stop this. For me. For the family." "You are not my family," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Not anymore. My family would never have put my plate on the floor." The color drained from his face. The fake sorrow vanished, replaced by a flash of sullen anger. He finally saw that the performance was over, that his emotional blackmail had failed. He stood up, his face hardening into the familiar lines of weak resentment I had seen so often over the past year. "Fine," he spat. "If that's how you want it. Don't come crying to me when you lose everything and end up in a state home. Sarah was right about you. You're just a bitter, ungrateful old woman." He walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the silent house. It was the sound of the last bridge burning. I did not cry. I simply sat there in my small cold room, a queen in exile, surveying the ruins of my old life and preparing for the war to claim my new one. The heaviest burden was no longer the fight ahead, but the knowledge that I would have to fight it utterly and completely alone. I told Mr. Chun to stop. In the sterile, glass-walled conference room of his downtown office, with the city buzzing silently below us, I folded my hands on the polished mahogany table and surrendered. The words felt like ash in my mouth, each one a betrayal of David's faith in me, a capitulation to the very evil he had tried to shield me from. "It's too much," I said, my voice a carefully constructed tremor. I let my gaze fall to my lap, studying the wrinkled skin of my knuckles. I had to look like a woman broken, a mother who could not bear to wage war against her only child. Ethan. He is my son. I can't destroy his family over this. It's just money. Mr. Chun, ever the professional, showed no flicker of emotion, but I could feel his sharp, intelligent eyes on me. He understood the game we were playing. I had called him the night before, after Ethan's performance of a lifetime, and laid out the new strategy. Not retreat but a feigned rout. A tactical collapse designed to lull the enemy into a false sense of security. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his tone grave, for the benefit of any watching eyes or listening ears. Are you absolutely certain? The document they produced is a clear forgery. We have experts ready to testify. Their entire claim is built on sand. I am certain, I whispered, and I allowed a single genuine tear to trace a path down my cheek. It wasn't hard to summon. The grief for the son I thought I had, the boy I had raised, was an ocean inside me. It was that grief I now weaponized. He begged me. What kind of mother would I be? Please, just drop it. Let them have it. The drive home was a blur of gray buildings and overcast skies. I let my head rest against the cool glass of the car window. My reflection a ghostly, defeated old woman. That's who I had to be now. When I walked through the front door, the air in the house was thick with a tense, expectant silence. Ethan and Sarah were in the living room, sitting on their beige sofa like a pair of vultures waiting for the last breath. Ethan stood up, his face a mask of anxious relief. Mom? What happened? I didn't look at him directly. I focused on a scuff mark on the hardwood floor. It's over, Ethan, I said, my voice barely audible. I told Mr. Chun to withdraw the claim. It's all yours. The restaurants. Everything David left for you. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound for a moment. Then she was on her feet, a brilliant predatory smile spreading across her face. Oh, Maddie, that is the most wonderful news. You see, Ethan, I told you she would do the right thing. She loves her family more than anything. She came over and wrapped her arms around me in a brittle, perfumed hug. I stood stiffly, a mannequin in her embrace, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. We were so worried about you, she cooed, pulling back to pat my cheek condescendingly. All this legal stress. It's not good for someone at your age. You look exhausted. I let my shoulders slump, my entire body conforming to the role I had chosen. I am tired, I said truthfully. I just want some peace. From that moment on, the change in the household was palpable. The tension didn't disappear. It transformed. It was no longer the tense silence of a cold war, but the smug, self-satisfied quiet of a victor enjoying the spoils. My performance had been convincing. Too convincing, perhaps. They saw me now not just as a burden, but as a doddering old fool who had been put back in her place. I was more invisible than ever. A ghost who washed their dishes and folded their laundry. And Sarah gloated. Oh, how she gloated. Her victory was not something to be savored quietly. It was a banner to be flown from the highest tower. She was on the phone constantly, her voice dripping with false modesty, carrying through the thin walls of the house. Yes, Brenda, it was just a terrible misunderstanding. I heard her say one afternoon, as I was on my hands and knees scrubbing a stain she'd made on the kitchen floor. Ethan's father, God rest his soul, had a very complicated will. Maddie got confused, poor thing. Her memory isn't what it used to be. We had to involve lawyers, can you believe it? But of course, once Ethan sat down and explained it all to her calmly, she understood. Family is what's most important after all. I kept scrubbing, the circular motion of the sponge a steady rhythmic counterpoint to the fury coiling in my gut. Each word she spoke was another stone, another brick in the wall I was building around my heart. The discussions about their new wealth began almost immediately. They happened right in front of me, as if I were a piece of furniture, incapable of hearing or understanding. I saw the most divine little property in Aspen, Sarah announced over dinner one evening, scrolling through her phone. It has a hot tub overlooking the mountains. Ethan, honey, we should look into selling off one of the smaller restaurant locations. That little bistro downtown, maybe? The one you always said was underperforming. Ethan, who had inherited none of his father's business acumen, nodded dumbly. Yeah, maybe. We could use the cash infusion to renovate the kitchen here, too. Get those marble countertops you wanted. They were talking about the Gilded Fork Corporation. My husband's legacy. My legacy. Sarah, a mid-level manager at the flagship Gilded Fork restaurant in our city, a position she only held because of her connection to Ethan, spoke of the company as if it were her personal piggy bank. She was blind to the fact that she was merely a cog in a vast machine, a machine I now secretly controlled. Her complaints about her job became my private, bitter comedy. "I swear, the idiots at corporate are trying to run us into the ground," she'd fume, kicking off her heels after a long day. "They sent out a new memo today about inventory management. A 3-page, single-spaced document of utter nonsense. Who has time for this?" My boss, Bill, he just shrugs and says, "Orders from the top." The top? The top is probably some overpaid MBA who's never worked a dinner rush in his life. I would just nod, my expression placid, a mask of mild senile interest. "That sounds difficult, dear," I'd murmur. I didn't tell her that I had spent 2 hours the previous afternoon on a conference call with the entire executive board, personally approving that new inventory protocol. I didn't tell her that the overpaid MBA was, in fact, a 70-year-old widow who knew more about profit and loss statements than she knew about genuine human decency. The irony was so sharp it was a physical taste in my mouth, metallic and cold. My days fell into a grueling, monotonous routine. I was their unpaid maid, their cook, their gardener. I scrubbed their toilets, washed their clothes, and tended to the rose bushes David had planted for me years ago at our old house, the ones I had painstakingly transplanted here. They saw a frail old woman fading into oblivion. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the warrior sharpening her blade in the shadows. While my hands were busy with soap and soil, Mr. Chan and his team were moving silently, methodically, like the chess master David had always been. We had abandoned the frontal assault on the forged document. That was Sarah and Ethan's game, loud, clumsy, and obvious. Ours was a campaign of whispers and shadows, far more deadly. Mr. Chan had decided on a new front. Not inheritance law but financial crime. "They think they've won the war, Mrs. Hayes," he had told me during a clandestine meeting in a quiet corner of the public library, the only place I could go without raising suspicion. "But all they've won is a single booby-trapped hill. We aren't going to prove you didn't sign that paper. We are going to prove they are unfit, untrustworthy, and malicious guardians of both your well-being and your finances. We will cut the ground out from under them." He began by subpoenaing the records for the joint bank account I had so foolishly set up when I first moved in, the account where I had deposited the entire proceeds from the sale of my home, my life savings. The paper trail was a roadmap of their greed. Thousands of dollars spent at designer boutiques, lavish vacations to the Caribbean, a down payment on a new luxury car for Ethan. All of it siphoned from my funds while I was being told we had to tighten our belts. Next, Mr. Chen's investigators began speaking quietly with my old neighbors, the ones who had known me and David for 40 years. They spoke to the mailman who saw me doing yard work in the dead of summer while Sarah sunbathed. They spoke to the woman from my old book club who had tried to visit, only to be told by Sarah that I was unwell and not accepting visitors. Testimonials were gathered, affidavits signed. A picture began to emerge, not of a confused old woman, but of a victim of systematic emotional and financial abuse. A story of isolation and neglect. Each new piece of evidence was a quiet thrill, a secret spark of hope in the suffocating darkness of that house. Mr. Chan would call me on a prepaid burner phone I kept hidden in an old shoebox at the back of my closet. I'd wait until Ethan and Sarah were asleep, then creep into the bathroom, turn on the fan for noise, and press the phone to my ear. "Good evening, Mrs. Hayes," his calm, professional voice would say. "I'm pleased to report that the bank has complied. We have a full accounting of every dollar they've misappropriated. It's extensive." "Thank you, Mr. Chan," I would whisper back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Another night it was, "We have a sworn statement from Mrs. Gable from next door. She witnessed Sarah yelling at you in the garden last month. Her testimony is quite powerful." Each call was a nail being hammered into their coffin. They slept soundly in their master bedroom, dreaming of aspen and marble countertops, completely unaware of the meticulous legal web being woven around them. The most significant move, however, happened far away from our quiet suburban street, in a place of power they couldn't even imagine. David, in his infinite foresight, had structured his will with layers of protection. Mr. Chan, as the executor of the estate, held proxy control over David's entire block of voting shares in the Gilded Fort Corporation until the inheritance was formally settled. And because of the morality clause Ethan had triggered, The true heir was now me. The forgery they had used to bully me into submission had no legal standing within the corporate structure itself. It was a civil matter, separate from the bylaws of the company. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was polishing the silver, Sarah had decided she wanted to use the good silver for a dinner party she was hosting. My hidden phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Chen's office. "Check your email. Urgent." I feigned a dizzy spell, pressing a hand to my forehead. "Oh my, I just feel a little faint. I think I need to go lie down for a moment." Sarah barely looked up from her magazine. "Fine, Maddie. Just be sure to finish that before you do. I want it to sparkle for Thursday." I nodded meekly and shuffled to my room, my heart pounding. I closed the door, retrieved my old, slow laptop from under the bed, and waited an eternity for it to boot up. There, in my inbox, was an email from Mr. Chen. The subject line was simple: board resolution. Inside was a scanned PDF, a formal corporate document filled with legal jargon. But I found the operative phrases quickly. Pursuant to the bylaws of the Gilded Fort Corporation and the executor's proxy held by Mr. Chen, the transfer of all Class A voting shares from the estate of David Hayes to the designated heir, Madison Hayes. A special session of the Board of Directors was convened this morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then the final earth-shattering resolutions. Be it resolved that Madison Hayes is hereby appointed to the Board of Directors. Be it further resolved that by a unanimous vote of the Board, Madison Hayes is hereby elected to the position of Chairwoman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of the Gilded Fort Corporation, effective immediately. I sat on the edge of my lumpy mattress, the cheap comforter bunched up around me, and read the words again. And again. Ew. Chairwoman. The titles felt alien, like words from another language describing a person I didn't know. I looked around the small beige room they had given me. It was a guest room, an afterthought, filled with mismatched furniture and smelling faintly of dust. This was the office of the new CEO of a multi-million-dollar restaurant empire. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt in over a year. It felt like stretching a muscle I thought had atrophied. Downstairs, I could hear Sarah on the phone, laughing about something. I closed the laptop and put it away. I walked back out to the dining room, picked up a tarnished silver fork and a soft cloth and began to polish. The repetitive motion was calming, meditative. As I rubbed away the tarnish, revealing the brilliant shine beneath, I felt like I was doing the same to my own soul. I was polishing away the hurt, the humiliation, the weakness. I was preparing for the dinner party. My dinner party. After all, I owned the company that employed the guest of honor. It was only fitting that I make sure everything was perfect for her big night. The night her world would come to an end. The gleam of the silver reflected my own eyes back at me, no longer dull and defeated, but sharp, focused, and gleaming with the promise of a reckoning. The fabric of the dress was a lie. It was the color of a rainy sky, a mousy, forgettable gray that absorbed light and attention in equal measure. Sarah had picked it out herself, holding it up against me with a critical eye. Her lips pursed in that way that was meant to look like thoughtful concentration but was really just thinly veiled contempt. "This is perfect, Madison," she'd cooed, her voice loud enough for Ethan to hear from the other room. "It's dignified, elegant but understated." What she meant was that it was the color of invisibility, the texture of irrelevance. It was a shroud for a woman she wanted to be socially dead. The drive to the gala was a silent torture chamber on wheels. They sat in the front of their gleaming German sedan, the scent of Sarah's expensive perfume a cloying cloud I couldn't escape. They murmured to each other, their voices a low, conspiratorial hum. They talked about bonuses, about networking, about the absolute lock Sarah had on the Manager of the Year award. I was a piece of luggage in the back seat, an inconvenient but necessary accessory for the evening's performance. The performance of Sarah, the devoted daughter-in-law, caring for her poor, fragile, and slightly senile mother-in-law. Every time she glanced at me in the rearview mirror, her smile was a flash of white teeth, a predator's warning. I met her gaze and held it, my own face a carefully constructed mask of benign confusion. Inside, a glacier was moving, slow and unstoppable, carving a new landscape out of my soul. The ballroom was a galaxy of glittering lights and manufactured laughter. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of tuxedos and sequined gowns. The air thrummed with ambition. Sarah kept a firm hand on my elbow, steering me through the crowd like a show pony. "Everyone, this is Ethan's mother, Madison," she would say to passing colleagues, her voice syrupy with pity. "We're so glad she could join us tonight. It's a bit much for her, but she insisted." She would pat my hand, a gesture that looked tender but was a clamp, a reminder of my place. I would offer a watery, unfocused smile, playing the part one had been rehearsing for months. The part of a woman whose mind was fading, whose will had been eroded. They saw a relic. They had no idea they were looking at a monument, waiting for the right moment to be unveiled. Our table was an insult disguised as a courtesy. Tucked away in a dark corner near the swinging doors of the kitchen, it offered a perfect view of the busing station, and a constant soundtrack of clattering plates and shouted orders. "It's quieter here for you, dear," Sarah had said, settling me into my chair. "Less overwhelming." She leaned in close, her perfume making my eyes water. "Now remember. Just water. We don't want any accidents, do we?" She gave my shoulder a squeeze that was just a little too hard. Then she and Ethan left, gliding toward their VIP table at the front of the room, leaving me in the shadows. From my forgotten corner I had a clear view of them. They were luminous under the main lights, the king and queen of their small gilded world. Ethan, my son, looked handsome in his tuxedo, but his spine seemed to have been surgically removed, replaced by a gelatinous core of acquiescence to his wife. He laughed when she laughed, nodded when she spoke, his eyes constantly seeking her approval. And Sarah, she was incandescent. She radiated a smug triumph, working the room, her hand on this one's arm, her head tilted in a pantomime of deep listening for that one. She was a master of surfaces, and tonight was the pinnacle of her craft. The waiter, a young man with tired eyes, came to my table. "Ma'am, can I get you something to drink?" "Just water, please," I said, my voice deliberately frail. He looked at me, then over at the head table where Sarah was holding court, then back at me. A flicker of something, pity, understanding, crossed his face. "Of course," he said, his voice softer this time. He returned with a tall glass of ice water and a small folded napkin. He placed it down carefully, as if it were a precious thing. He didn't know it, but his small act of professional decency was a balm on 1,000 tiny wounds. I watched the ceremony begin. The speeches were long and droning, full of corporate jargon and self-congratulation. I barely listened. Instead, I let my mind drift back to David. I could almost feel him sitting beside me, his warm, solid presence a phantom limb I still ached for. He had hated events like this. A room full of peacocks preening for each other, he used to call it. But he would have come tonight. For me. He would have seen the gray dress and the corner table and the pitying looks, and a quiet, terrible rage would have begun to burn behind his calm eyes. "Just a little longer, my love," I thought, my hand resting on my lap. "The curtain is about to rise." Across the room I saw him. Mr. Chun. He stood near the back wall, impeccable in his dark suit, his face impassive. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at me. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the signal I needed. The glacier inside me began to crack. Then came the award for Manager of the Year. When Sarah's name was announced, the applause from her table was deafening. She feigned a moment of shocked surprise, a hand fluttering to her chest, before composing her face into a mask of humble gratitude. Ethan kissed her, beaming like a proud puppy. She practically floated to the stage, the spotlight following her every step. She took the Crystal Award and held it up. "Oh my goodness," she began, her voice catching with practiced emotion. "I am just speechless. I want to thank the board, my incredible team, but most of all, my amazing husband, Ethan." She blew him a kiss. "And my wonderful mother-in-law, Madison, who is here with us tonight." The spotlight operator, clearly on instruction, swung the beam across the room, and suddenly I was pinned in its harsh white glare. 100 heads turned. Her strength and grace, even in her difficult times, are a daily inspiration. "This is for you, Madison." The applause was thunderous. It was the perfect, calculated move. She had used me as her final, most pathetic prop, cementing her image as a saint. I smiled weakly into the light, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I watched her return to her table, the triumphant heroine, placing the award in the center like a crown. She owned this room. She owned my son. She believed she owned me. The mistake was fatal. The master of ceremonies returned to the podium, shuffling his cards. That concludes our main awards for the evening, folks. Let's have another round of applause for all our winners. After the clapping died down, he continued. But before we let you get to the dessert and dancing, our outgoing chairman of the board, Mr. Arthur Thompson, has one final special announcement to make. Arthur Thompson was a man from another era. Tall, silver-haired, with a gravitas that commanded attention without needing to raise his voice. He had been David's oldest friend, the one person in the world who knew the truth of the empire David had built in the shadows. He walked to the stage with a slow, deliberate pace, his face somber. The festive mood in the room immediately tempered. "Thank you," Arthur began, his voice a low rumble that filled the vast hall. The jovial chatter ceased. "Tonight, we have celebrated the present success of the Gilded Fork. We've honored the managers and teams who make this company a leader in its field." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "But I am here to talk about its past. And its future." I saw Sarah whisper something to Ethan, a smug little smile on her face. They probably thought this was a prelude to announcing a new stock option plan or a corporate expansion. They were thinking about money. They were always thinking about money. "Most of you know the Gilded Fork as a publicly traded corporation," Arthur continued. "But corporations do not have souls. They do not have vision. People do. This company, this entire empire, did not spring from a boardroom. It was born from the passion and quiet genius of one man. A man who, for his own reasons, chose to remain a silent partner, the invisible hand guiding us for over 40 years. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not on the program. This was new. I saw Ethan lean forward, intrigued. Sarah's brow furrowed. This was a story she didn't know. A variable she hadn't accounted for, and she hated unaccounted for variables. "He was my friend," Arthur said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "He believed that a good meal was not about luxury but about dignity. He believed that hospitality was a sacred trust. He passed away just over a year ago, and his absence has left a void that can never be filled. But his legacy must and will endure." On the two giant screens that flanked the stage, a photograph faded into view. It wasn't a corporate headshot. It was a candid photo, black and white, taken decades ago. A young man with dark, laughing eyes had his arm around a young woman with a bright, hopeful smile. He was holding a half-eaten apple. She was leaning into him, her head on his shoulder. They were sitting on a picnic blanket in a sun-dappled park. They were David and me. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a physical thing, a sudden intake of air that left a vacuum of stunned silence in its wake. I saw it all happen as if in slow motion. Ethan's face went slack, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. His eyes darted from the screen to me, back to the screen, a look of utter, stupefying disbelief on his face. But it was Sarah's reaction that I would cherish forever. The color drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a painted mask on a corpse. Her perfect smile dissolved, her mouth falling slightly open. The smug triumph in her eyes was replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. Her brain, so quick and calculating, was short-circuiting, unable to process the data. The woman in the photo was young and vibrant. The woman at the back table was old and gray. But they were, undeniably, the same person. And that person was sitting next to the man Arthur Thompson was calling the soul of the company. His name, Arthur's voice boomed in the cathedral-like silence, was David Hayes. Another wave of shock rippled through the audience. Hayes. The name was known. It was the name of the pathetic old woman in the corner. David's will was a testament to the man he was, Arthur went on, his gaze now fixed on the front table, on my son and his wife. It was precise, it was wise, and it was conditional. He stipulated that his life's work, his controlling interest in this corporation, should not pass to an heir who lacked the core values on which it was built: family, respect, and decency. Arthur let those words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. Upon his death, his estate entered a 1-year probationary period, monitored by his legal counsel. That period ended yesterday. Evidence was presented. A morality clause was triggered. Ethan looked like he was going to be sick. Sarah's eyes, wide with terror, finally locked onto mine across the expanse of the room. The mask was gone. I was no longer the frail, confused old woman. In her eyes I saw that she was finally seeing me, and she was terrified. And so, Arthur Thompson's voice rose, filled with a profound and personal satisfaction. It is my distinct and solemn honor to introduce to you all the sole inheritor of David Hayes's legacy, the new majority shareholder, and the new chairman and CEO of the Gilded Fort Corporation, Mrs. Madison Hayes. For a heart-stopping moment there was no sound, no applause, just the weight of 200 people staring, trying to reconcile the image of the pathetic creature in gray with the name of the new titan of their industry. The spotlight found me again. No longer an intrusion but a coronation. Slowly, I placed my napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs on the polished floor unnervingly loud in the silence. I stood up. I felt the years fall away, the stoop in my shoulders straighten, the fog of pretended weakness burn away. I was not the woman who had entered this room. I was the woman David had loved, the woman who had helped him proofread business plans at a tiny kitchen table, the woman whose strength he had always believed in, even when I had forgotten it myself. Mr. Chun was suddenly at my side. He offered his arm. "Madam Chairman," he said, his voice low and steady. I took it, and together, we began the long walk from the darkness of the back corner to the brilliant light of the stage. Every eye in the room followed me. I walked past tables of stunned executives, their mouths agape. As I passed the head table, I did not look at my son, whose face was ashen. I did not look at his wife, whose entire world had just been reduced to rubble. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage, my throne. Arthur met me with a warm, proud smile and stepped aside. Mr. Chun discreetly handed me a pair of elegant reading glasses from his jacket pocket. I did not need them to see, but they were part of the costume of this new role. I walked to the podium. The microphone was adjusted for Arthur's height, and I took a moment to lower it to mine. The small, deliberate action seemed to break the spell. A hesitant, then thunderous wave of applause erupted through the room. It was not applause of celebration, but of shock and awe. I waited for it to die down. The silence that returned was different. It was electric with anticipation. I looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of wealth and power. And then my gaze found Sarah. She was still staring at me, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and naked fear. Ethan sat beside her, shrunken, a ghost at his own wife's execution. "Good evening," I said. My voice, when it came out, was not the reedy, frail whisper they were used to. It was clear, calm, and resonant with an authority I hadn't used since I commanded a classroom of rowdy teenagers decades ago. It was the voice of a woman in charge. "Thank you, Arthur, for that kind introduction, and for your lifelong friendship to my late husband, David." I paused, letting the reality of the situation settle in. "I know this is unexpected. For the past year I have been, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. I have observed, I have listened, and I have learned a great deal about the people who work for the company my husband poured his life into building." I let my eyes sweep the room before they landed, once again, on Sarah. I gave her a small cold smile. "But before we move on to the future, I have one final piece of old business to attend to tonight. It has come to my attention that some of our employees, even some of our award-winning managers," I said, letting the words twist like a knife, "do not align with our core values. Those values I mentioned earlier: family, respect, decency." The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "For instance," I continued, my tone conversational, as if discussing a minor line item in a budget, "we have a zero-tolerance policy for dishonesty, for fraud. For individuals who believe they can build a life on lies and conceal the wreckage they leave behind. I looked directly at her now. The entire ballroom, every single person, followed my gaze and turned to stare at the woman at the head table. She was pinned by the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. It takes a certain kind of person to hide who they truly are. A new name, a new city, it can cover a lot of sins. Isn't that right, Jennifer? The name dropped into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. It wasn't her name. And yet, from the violent, convulsive flinch that rocked her body, it was clear that it was. Ethan swiveled his head to look at her, his face a mask of utter confusion. Jennifer, he mouthed. Jennifer Albright, I clarified, my voice crisp and clear. That was your name back in Scottsdale, wasn't it? Before a tragic accident. The one on the night of May 14th, 11 years ago. The one where you were behind the wheel of your father's BMW. With a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. Sarah made a small choking sound. Her carefully constructed world was not just cracking. It was being systematically demolished brick by brick, in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. You crippled a young woman that night, I stated, the fact laid bare, cold and hard. A 22-year-old nursing student named Chloe Larson. Her family couldn't afford a long legal battle. Your wealthy parents, however, could afford a very good lawyer and an even better cover-up. They buried it. They paid for silence, moved you across the country, and gave you a new name. Sarah. A much softer, gentler name than Jennifer, isn't it? I let the horrific truth sink in. I could see the dawning comprehension on the faces in the crowd, the disgust, the whispered shock. My husband, I said, my voice dropping slightly, was a meticulous man. He did not trust easily. When his only son brought home a fiancée, he had a private investigator do a standard background check. A discreet one. He discovered your past, Jennifer. He learned everything. And it horrified him. I shook my head, a gesture not of sadness, but of cold confirmation. He wanted to tell Ethan, but he feared it would drive his son away forever. So instead he did something else. He protected his legacy. He wrote a will with a very specific, very personal morality clause. It wasn't a vague legal term. It was a weapon designed with you and only you in mind. He knew your character. He gambled that sooner or later your true nature, the cruelty, the disrespect, the utter lack of decency, would reveal itself. He just had to make sure the right person was there to witness it. I looked at Sarah, whose face had crumpled into an unrecognizable mask of tear-streaked makeup in pure primal terror. You treated his wife like a dog, I finished, my voice like a chip of ice. You triggered his claws. And you have just handed me his entire empire. I took off the reading glasses and set them on the podium. My speech was over. My reign had begun. I turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind the deafening, beautiful sound of absolute and total silence. The silence in the grand ballroom was louder than the applause had ever been. The last of the waiters had cleared the final champagne flute. The band had packed away their instruments, and the scent of wilting flowers and stale triumph hung heavy in the air. It was a cavern of echoes now, the polished marble floor reflecting the ghost of 1,000 conversations. And in the center of it all 3 figures remained, a tableau of a world irrevocably shattered. I stood, not feeling the ache in my bones, not feeling the exhaustion that should have been there after a night like this. I felt a strange, cold clarity, as if I were watching a play whose ending I had written myself. Then the sound. A soft rustle of expensive silk, a sharp, choked sob, and Sarah fell. Not in a graceful swoon, but in an uncoordinated heap, her designer gown pooling around her like spilled ink. She landed on her knees, the very position she had so delighted in putting me. The irony was so thick I could taste it, metallic and bitter like old blood. She crawled a few inches forward, her perfectly manicured hands splayed on the floor. Her face, which hours ago had been a mask of smug condescension, was now a ruin of running mascara and raw panic. "Madison, please," she whimpered, the sound pathetic in the vast emptiness. "Please don't do this." I remained silent. I let her words hang there, let them dissipate into the high coffered ceilings. I watched Ethan. He hadn't moved. He stood a few feet away from his kneeling wife, his skin the color of ash. His expensive tuxedo seemed to hang off his frame, as if he'd shrunk inside it. His eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing nothing. He was a statue carved from regret, a hollow man in a hollow room. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He couldn't. "Everything I've worked for," Sarah babbled, her voice rising in hysteria. "My position, my reputation, it's my whole life. You can't just take it away. It's not fair. Not fair." The words almost made me laugh. I thought of the cold floor of my bedroom, the threadbare clothes, the carefully constructed lies she told her friends about my failing mind. I thought of the chipped plate and the dog's leftovers. I thought of her hand, yanking my arm as she guided me to my special seat at the back of the gala, a prop for her performance of the loving daughter-in-law. I looked down at her, a crumpled mess of silk and desperation. It wasn't forgiveness she was begging for. She hadn't said my son's name once. She hadn't said she was sorry for the cruelty, for the theft of my money, my dignity, my time. She was pleading for the scaffolding of her life, the one she had built with stolen materials on a foundation of lies. She was begging for the illusion. "Please, Madison," she cried, reaching a hand out, not to touch me, but as if to grasp at the power that had slipped through her fingers. "I'll do anything. Just let me keep my job. Let me keep my life." Ethan finally made a sound, a soft, strangled noise in his throat, but he said nothing. He simply stood there, a silent accomplice to the very end, watching the life he'd enabled, the life he'd chosen over his own mother, crumble into dust. He had made his choice long ago. Every single time he had looked away, every time he had stayed silent, the power dynamic hadn't just been reversed, it had been atomized. There was nothing left to reverse. There was only me, and the wreckage they had made of themselves. I finally drew a breath, the air cool and clean in my lungs. My voice, when it came, was not the trembling whisper they were used to. It was level, calm, and as hard as the marble beneath our feet. "You want to work for the Gilded Fork?" I asked, the question hanging in the air with surgical precision. A flicker of hope ignited in her tear-filled eyes. She nodded frantically, a pathetic, jerky motion. Yes, I'll work harder than ever, I promise." "Fine," I said. I let the word settle. I watched that flicker of hope grow into a desperate flame. Then I extinguished it. "Your new position is janitorial apprentice. You will report to the downtown Denver location tomorrow morning, at 5 a.m. sharp." Her face froze, the hopeful smile curdling on her lips. What did you say?" "Your first task," I continued, my voice unwavering, "will be scrubbing the main kitchen floors. On your knees." The word struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, her mouth opening and closing silently. On your knees. I wanted her to feel the cold tile. I wanted her to know the humiliation of that posture, a posture of supplication she had forced on me as a game. "You will keep this job for as long as I see fit," I stated, each word a nail in the coffin of her former life. "That is your first option." "Option," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Or," I said, my gaze as cold and unyielding as a winter sky, "you can refuse. And at 5:01 a.m. tomorrow, Mr. Chun will release his entire very comprehensive file on your past to the press. He will personally deliver a copy to the family of the young woman you crippled in that hit and run all those years ago, the one your father's money made disappear. The choice is yours, Sarah. Or should I say, Jennifer?" Her entire body went rigid. The blood drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, terrifying pallor. She knew that I knew everything. The real secret. The rotten core around which she had built her entire fraudulent life. David hadn't just been a good man. He had been a thorough one. I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't need one. Her choice was irrelevant to me. My part was done. I turned my back on both of them, on the groveling woman on the floor and the silent, broken man who was once my son. The sound of my heels clicking on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. It was the sound of walking away. It was the sound of freedom. I never spoke to Ethan again. In the days that followed, my phone would light up with his name, a ghost on the screen. I never answered. I imagined his pleas, his excuses, his attempts to reframe history, to cast me as the vengeful old woman who destroyed his family. But there was nothing to say. He chose her time and time again. His final choice was to stand in silence as she knelt. That silence was his answer, and it was the last word between us. I moved into a penthouse overlooking the city. From my window, the world sprawls out like a blanket of diamonds, distant and beautiful. It's the very apartment they used to talk about in hushed, greedy tones, a symbol of the life they plan to live with my money. The irony is not lost on me, but it no longer brings a bitter taste. It is simply a fact. The quiet here is different. It's not the heavy, oppressive silence of their house, thick with unspoken resentment. It's a clean, expansive silence. The silence of solitude, not of loneliness. I run my company, David's company, with the ruthlessness they taught me I needed to survive. In board meetings, I see their faces in the ambitious young executives trying to play an angle. I see Sarah's cunning and Ethan's passive ambition. But they cannot touch me. I learned the game from the inside, from the bottom up. I know every move before it's made. Some nights it's quiet. The city lights blur, and the weight of it all settles in my bones. I lost a son. That is a truth that no amount of money or power can erase. A part of my heart was amputated, and the phantom limb still aches on cold nights. I grieve for the boy he was, not the man he became. But then I walk past the great mirror in the hall, the one with the gilded frame. And I stop. I don't see a frail old woman. I don't see a charity case or a burden. I don't see the woman who ate scraps off the floor. I look in the mirror and I see a queen, her armor forged in fire, her crown paid for with tears. I see a survivor. And I know with every fiber of my being that freedom is worth any price. My name is Madison Hayes, and my story is not over. It has just begun.